the recipe card I kept, and the subpoenas I served, instead of dessert. You've got the surest eye for a bad seed lot of anyone I've ever hired, Freya, and I'd trust it over any lab in the state. That was Lyle Brenner talking, back in the spring of 1994, leaning on the tailgate of his dusty green Ford in a wheat field outside Ritzville, and I was 51 years old and foolish enough to feel my chest warm at the compliment, the way a barn cat leans into a hand it has decided is safe. I can still smell that morning, the particular green bite of young winter wheat crushed under our boots, the diesel and the dust, and the faint sourness of the coffee we'd let go cold in the truck cab. Lyle had a way of making you feel chosen, and I, who had spent a working life being told that a woman with dirt under her nails was a curiosity rather than an authority, took the being chosen and folded it up small and carried it around like a warm stone in a coat pocket. I believed him. That is the thing I need you to understand before anything else, because everyone always wants to know why a woman who ended up where I ended up ever trusted a man like that in the first place. And the plain answer is that he told me I was good at the one thing I had staked my whole life on, and I was starved enough to eat it. My name is Freya Lockhart, and I was raised on a dryland wheat and lentil operation in Adams County, Washington, the fourth of 5 children and the only one who cared more about why the crop failed than about the failing. My father, Axel, kept his seed samples in labeled mason jars on a shelf above the wood stove, and when I was 7, he taught me to shake a jar and read the sound of it, the difference between plump kernels and shriveled ones, chaff and grit. I went to Washington State University in Pullman on a scholarship a Lutheran Ladies Auxiliary put together nickel by nickel, and I came out an agronomist in 1965 when there were, by my honest count, 3 other women in my graduating cohort, and none of them lasted 5 years in the field. I lasted 40. By the time Lyle Brenner recruited me to Grandview Agricultural Sciences in 1994, I had spent decades certifying seed lots, diagnosing wilts and rots and nutrient deficiencies, and testifying, more than a few times, as an expert witness in disputes over crop failures and mislabeled inventory. Because it turns out that a woman who can explain to a jury why a soybean field died is worth her weight in billable hours. Lyle knew all of that. He hired me to run quality certification for a company that sold seed and soil amendments across 4 states. And for a good long while, I thought I had finally landed somewhere that valued the eye my father gave me. Let me set my ordinary down for you, the good version, the one before, because I want it to have weight. In those years, I lived in a 1936 brick bungalow in the Sunny Slope neighborhood outside Wenatchee, with a kitchen the size of a confessional and a south window where I kept a jade plant that had been my mother's, propagated from a cutting she'd carried west in a coffee can. On Sundays, I baked. My mother had left me a tin recipe box, the kind with a hinged lid painted with faded tulips, and inside it were cards in 3 different hands, hers, my grandmother Ingrid's, and mine, for cardamom bread and lefse and a lemon pound cake that took 11 egg yolks and made the whole street smell like a bakery. I sang in the choir at Grace Lutheran, second alto, badly, but with conviction. I kept a garden that embarrassed my neighbors into fertilizing theirs. And I had, in a drawer I did not open often, a set of framed things I had earned in an earlier chapter that I did not talk about at work, because I had learned that a woman is easier to swallow when she seems like only one thing at a time. I will get to those in their season. For now, understand only that my life was full and quiet and mine, and that I had built it plank by plank without asking anyone's permission, and that when a man tells a woman like that she is good at her work, he is not paying a small compliment. He is handing her the one currency she cannot make for herself. The first wrong note came in the autumn of 1997, and it was so small that I talked myself out of it before I'd finished hearing it. We had a shipment of certified alfalfa seed, 40,000 pounds of it, bound for a co-op in Umatilla, and my germination test came back at 71% against a labeled 92. That is not a rounding error. That is the difference between a farmer's living and his ruin. I flagged the lot, wrote it up clean and dated, and walked the paperwork to Lyle myself, because I liked him, and I thought he'd want to know before it went out the door. He read it standing up, and I watched his thumb move. This is the thing I noticed, the thing I want you to hold on to. His right thumb worried at the side of his index finger, rubbing the skin there in a small circular motion, the way a boy rubs a bruise he doesn't want anyone to see. Then he smiled and said the lab must have had a bad calibration day, and he'd have Roberta rerun it, and that I should take the afternoon. I'd earned it. The rerun came back at 93. I told myself, calibrations do drift. I told myself Roberta, who ran the wet lab, was thorough. I told myself a great many reasonable things, because the alternative was to believe that the man who had made me feel chosen had just looked me in the eye and let a bad lot ship. The alfalfa went to Umatilla. I did not sleep well for a week, and then I slept fine, because that is what a person does. The erosion came slowly after that, the way a coulee wall goes, not all at once, but a little more each spring, until one day the fence you built is hanging in the air. In 1998, Lyle moved my desk. It sounds like nothing. He moved me from the certification office, where I could see the intake doc and read the manifests as they came in, to a windowless room down the hall that had been a supply closet, and he framed it as a promotion, a senior advisory role. And I let him, because he said the word senior, and I was 55 and grateful. What it meant, though I did not see it for months, was that manifests stopped crossing my desk before shipping and started crossing it after, if at all. I was being moved from the gate to the archive, from the woman who could stop a truck to the woman who could only describe, later, the truck that had already gone. In 1999, my signature started appearing on certifications I had not signed. I found the first one by accident, a soil amendment analysis for a vineyard operation down in the Yakima Valley, and there at the bottom was my name in a hand that curved my capital F wrong, too round, like a person who had practiced it from a distance. I brought it to Lyle. His thumb went to his finger again, that small, worrying circle, and he told me it was a clerical convenience, that with me so busy on advisory matters, the office had adopted a signature stamp to keep the paperwork moving, and hadn't he mentioned it, he was sure he'd mentioned it. He had not mentioned it. A signature stamp of a certifying agronomist's name is not a convenience. It is a loaded gun left on a kitchen table where children play. I asked him to retire the stamp. He said, of course, absolutely, first thing Monday. It was never retired. I know that now. The next spring, in 2000, Roberta stopped meeting my eye in the break room. Roberta Kessler was maybe 40 then, ambitious in the hard, bright way of a person who has decided that the people above her are the only people worth pleasing. And she had come up under Lyle, and there was something between them I never fully mapped. Not romance, I don't think, but a kind of mutual usefulness, each holding a rope the other was climbing. When the germination numbers on a canola lot came back low that April, and I asked to see the raw plates, Roberta told me the plates had been discarded per protocol and that Mr. Brenner had already reviewed the summary. Mr. Brenner. She had called him Lyle for 6 years. Language shifts like that are the tremor before the slide, and I felt it. And I said nothing, because I had begun to understand that I was standing on ground that was no longer mine, and I did not yet know where the solid part was. That is the honest, unflattering middle of this story. For the better part of 3 years, I absorbed it. I kept my own private records because keeping records was bred into me, but I told myself I was keeping them for tidiness and not for war. The fourth blow was the quietest and the worst in its way, because it was aimed at the part of me I had guarded most carefully. At the 2001 Regional Certification Conference in Spokane, a younger colleague named Denise Whitfield, who ran quality for a competitor and whom I had always liked, took me aside by the coffee urns and asked, kindly, careful, whether it was true that I had signed off on that Umatilla alfalfa disaster. the Umatilla alfalfa. It had failed. Of course it had failed. 71% germination does not become 92 because a man wishes it. And a co-op had lost the better part of a season. And somewhere in the retelling, the failure had grown my name on it. Not Lyle's, not Roberta's, mine. The woman who had flagged it in writing on a dated form was now, in the mouths of my own profession, the woman who had let it ship. I stood there with the styrofoam cup going soft in my hand and understood that a reputation is a slow crop, 40 years in the growing, and that someone had been quietly poisoning the soil under mine while telling me my eye was the surest in the state. The offense itself, the one that ended my capacity to absorb, came in November of 2001, and it came by certified mail. The Washington State Department of Agriculture had opened a formal investigation into falsified seed certifications at Grandview Agricultural Sciences, mislabeled germination rates, fabricated soil analyses, forged certifying signatures, and the certifying agronomist of record, named in the complaint that had triggered the investigation, was Freya Lockhart. The complaint had been filed by the company. The company was Lyle. He had reported me for the fraud he had built, brick by brick, out of my moved desk and my stamped signature and my discarded plates. And he had done it, I would later learn, because the investigation had become inevitable, and someone had to wear it. And a man who has spent 7 years turning a woman into a signature has also, without quite meaning to, turned her into a defendant. I sat at my mother's kitchen table with that letter, and the jade plant was throwing its late afternoon shadow across the tulip-painted recipe box. And I did not weep, and I did not rage. I read the letter 4 times, and on the 4th reading, somewhere under the fear, a much older and colder thing woke up in me and stretched. And it was not a plan. It was recognition. Because there was a fact about my life that Lyle Brenner had never bothered to learn, not because I hid it, but because he had never once been curious about who I was when I was not being useful to him. Here is the thing I had folded into that drawer with the framed certificates, the thing I did not talk about at work. Between 1972 and 1988, before I ever came to Grandview, I had gone back to school at night and earned a law degree from Gonzaga in Spokane, and I had spent 16 years as an agricultural and environmental attorney, and then, from 1988 to 1993, I had sat as a judge on the Washington State Court of Appeals, Division III, until I retired from the bench and went back to the fields I actually loved, because a courtroom, for all its uses, does not smell like young wheat. I did not advertise this at Grandview. I had learned across a long life that men manage a woman better when they believe she is small, and I had let Lyle believe it because being underestimated is a kind of privacy, and I valued my privacy. But a retired appellate judge does not forget how a case is built, and she does not forget the difference between what happened and what can be proven. And above all, she does not forget that the person who controls the record controls the verdict. Lyle had spent 7 years teaching me that last lesson himself. He simply never understood that I already knew it, and had known it before he was old enough to lie. I did not scheme, and I want to be precise about that, because this was never a trap. It was housekeeping. The first thing I did, the Monday after the letter came, was drive to Spokane and sit down in the offices of Grandview Legal. No relation to the company, a genuine coincidence of name that would later delight me. Across a walnut table from Gloria Amsden, an attorney I had known since our night school days at Gonzaga. A woman of 72 by then, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a memory like a bear trap. I laid out everything. I laid out my dated flag on the Umatilla alfalfa, which I had kept. I laid out my written request that the signature stamp be retired, which I had sent by memo and copied to myself at home, out of nothing but old habit. I laid out the germination logs I had photocopied on Sunday afternoons in the office when it was empty, not because I suspected a fraud, but because a farmer's daughter does not throw away a number. Gloria read for 2 hours, and then she took off her glasses and let them fall against her chest on their little chain, and she said, "Freya, they didn't just wrong you. They built you a house of evidence and left the door unlocked." And I said, "I know. I helped pour the foundation. I just never left the country while it dried." What followed was not dramatic, and I will not pretend it was. It was subpoenas and depositions and a chain of custody reconstructed from photocopies and memos and the calibration logs of a wet lab that, it turned out, Roberta had never actually discarded, because Roberta, whatever else she was too careful a scientist to throw away raw data, and had merely been told to say she had. There is a lovely, terrible irony in that. The woman who lied to protect the man could not bring herself to destroy the numbers that would sink him. Gloria and I documented 7 separate falsified certifications, a signature stamp used 411 times over 3 years, and a single email, recovered, of course, because nothing is ever really deleted, in which Lyle instructed the office manager, a decent, frightened man named Curtis Yao, to route the low germination results to Freya's advisory queue, so they would, in Lyle's own written words, land on her file. Curtis, when it counted, did not hide behind the rules. He told the investigators the truth in a plain, scared voice. And later he told me, in the parking lot of a Denny's off I-90 where we met so he would not be seen, that he had wanted to warn me for 2 years and had been too afraid of losing his mortgage, and that his mother had raised him better than the man he'd let himself be. I told him his mother would be proud he'd finally spoken, and I meant it, and I watched a grown man's shoulders come down 2 inches for the first time in years. That mattered to me more than any subpoena. A single, honest voice, offered at cost, is worth more than 100 that come free after the danger passes. The investigation was slow, the way real justice is slow, all of 2002 and into 2003, and while it ground forward, the case moved from the administrative side into the courts. And here is where the last piece fell into place with a click I could feel in my teeth. When the criminal referral came down against Lyle Brenner for fraud and forgery, and he appealed a pretrial evidentiary ruling, a motion to suppress the very germination logs that damned him, on a technicality about how they'd been gathered, that appeal was routed, in the ordinary spin of the wheel, to the Washington State Court of Appeals, Division 3, my old division. And while I had retired from the bench in 1993, the panel that would hear it was made up of judges I had trained beside, one of whom I had helped seat, and the presiding judge, Harriet Oyalaran, had been my law clerk in 1990 and had learned how to read a chain of custody at my elbow. I did not sit on that panel. A decent judge does not touch a case she is a witness in, and I was very much a witness. But I did not have to sit on it. The record I had spent 40 years learning how to build spoke perfectly well without me in the room. The motion to suppress was denied 9 pages into a unanimous opinion, and Harriet, who has a dry streak I like to think she caught from me, cited the principle that a party who manufactures evidence against another cannot then claim a technical shelter when that same evidence is turned to the truth. She did not name me. She did not have to. I read the slip opinion standing at my own kitchen counter, and I laughed until the jade plant trembled. Now, the country club the following Monday, and the dessert I did not serve. There is a country club in the suburbs east of Seattle, out past Bellevue toward the Cascade foothills, called the Sammamish Highlands Club. All cedar beams and river rock fireplaces, and a dining room that looks out over a golf course green enough to make an agronomist weep for the water it drank. Grandview Agricultural Sciences held its annual Investors and Partners Dinner there every year on the 3rd Monday of March, a self-congratulatory affair with a plated meal and a keynote, and at the end, an award or two. In the spring of 2003, with the criminal case pending but not yet public in the way it would become, Lyle Brenner still had enough of the company's confidence and enough of a hold on Roberta, who by then was his deputy, to stand at the head of that room and act as though the ground beneath him were solid. I was, by a small arrangement Gloria and I did not leave to chance, invited. Not as a defendant, as a retired senior advisor being quietly honored for years of service, an invitation Lyle himself had signed off on because it flattered his narrative that the unpleasantness with me was all a misunderstanding, water under a bridge, and what better way to sell that than to have the old woman clap politely at her own dinner. He thought he was managing me one last time. He had always thought that. I wore navy and my grandmother Ingrid's garnet earrings, and I sat at table 4 with Gloria beside me in her good gray suit and a slim leather folio on her lap that no one gave a second glance, because who suspects 2 women in their 70s of anything but the salt? Roberta was at the head table in a red dress, laughing too loudly at Lyle's jokes, her hand touching his sleeve now and then in that old rope-holding way. And I watched Lyle across the candlelight and saw, even from 4 tables off, the thumb working at the finger, the small, circular worry, because a part of him always knew, even when the rest of him was bulletproof. The dinner went on. There was a salmon course and a beef course and a great deal of talk about the coming season's projections. Lyle stood and spoke for 11 minutes about integrity in agricultural science, and I will confess the muscles of my face ached from the pleasantness I held on them. Then the servers came out with the dessert, a little plated slice of something with a raspberry coulis and a mint leaf laid on like a promise. And as the plate settled in front of Lyle Brenner, Gloria rose from her chair with the ease of a woman who has spent a lifetime knowing exactly when to stand. And she walked the length of that cedar-beamed room, and she sat down in front of Lyle, and then in front of Roberta, in place of the sweet, 2-folded blue-backed documents, 1 apiece. Subpoenas duces tecum, commands to appear and to produce, issued in the civil suit I had filed the previous week, the one for defamation and for the destruction of a professional reputation 40 years in the making, the one that would run alongside the state's criminal case like a second team of horses pulling the same wagon. I had waited to file it until the criminal evidence was locked, until the appellate ruling had shut Lyle's last technical door, until the ground was so solid that no motion of his could shake it. And I had chosen the following Monday, this dining room, not out of cruelty, though I am not saint enough to say there was none, but because a lie told in public deserves to be answered in the same room, in front of the same faces, at the same table where the man had stood 11 minutes earlier and used the word integrity as if he owned it. Lyle did not go pale, and he did not beg. That was never his nature. He was a weak man, but weakness does not always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like a man reaching for the strong hand that has held him up all along. He looked first and instantly at Roberta, not at Gloria, not at me, not at the document. At Roberta, the way a boy caught out looks at the older kid who talked him into it. And in that one glance, the whole architecture of 7 years laid itself bare. That he had never once been the engine of the thing, only the face bolted to the front of it, pushed and steered and enabled by a harder, cleverer will beside him, and that even now, cornered, his first instinct was not to fight, but to find out from her what he was supposed to do. Roberta, to her credit or her damnation, did not look back at him. She looked at me all the way across the room, and something moved behind her eyes that I have thought about many times since. Not remorse exactly, but the flat recalculation of a person who has just understood she bet on the wrong horse and is already in real time working out how to unsaddle it. She would, in the depositions to come, turn on Lyle so thoroughly and so precisely that I almost admired the craftsmanship, handing over the emails and the calibration logs she'd kept, cutting her own deal, and the man who had leaned on her for 7 years discovered what all weak men discover eventually, that the strong hand steadying you is the same hand that will let go the instant you become a weight. I did not gloat. I want that on the record, because the version of this story where I stand and make a speech is not the version that happened, and the truth is better. What happened is that I finished my coffee. I let Gloria walk back to our table, and I sat with my hands folded over Ingrid's earrings warm in my ears, and I let the room's discomfort wash around me like creek water around a stone. And after a decent minute, I stood, and I said only, to the table nearest me and loudly enough to carry, that the dessert was lovely, and I regretted I couldn't stay for it, and that anyone with questions about the certifications should feel free to direct them to my counsel. And then Gloria and I walked out across that ridiculous green carpet under the cedar beams, two old women in good suits, past the River Rock fireplace and the mounted trophy trout, and out into the cool, wet Cascade evening. And I felt, for the first time in 6 years, that the ground under my feet was mine again, poured and cured and load-bearing, and that no one was ever going to move my desk again. The civil suit settled in the autumn of 2003, before it ever reached a jury, because Lyle's own lawyers could read a record as well as I could. And the settlement did 3 things that mattered to me, and 1 that did not. It did not make me rich, and I did not care. There was money, enough to matter, but I have never been a woman who counted her life in dollars. And I will only say that the figure was large enough that Grandview Agricultural Sciences dissolved within 18 months, and its assets were sold to a firm out of Boise, and small enough that I never had to think about it again after it was done. What mattered was the other 3. The State Agriculture Department issued a formal correction to its record, expunging the complaint against me and noting, in language Gloria fought for line by line, that Freya Lockhart had flagged the Umatilla alfalfa deficiency in writing and had been overruled. The Regional Certification Board, the same body whose members had whispered my name over coffee urns in Spokane, restored my certification in good standing, and, in a gesture that surprised me into a rare public tear, invited me to chair its Ethics Review Committee, which I declined, gently, because I had spent enough of my life in rooms where people talked about integrity, and I wanted to go home to my garden. Lyle Brenner pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of forgery in the 2nd degree and 1 of fraud, served 14 months at the state facility in Airway Heights, and vanished from the industry so completely that the last I ever heard of him, he was selling recreational vehicles outside Coeur d'Alene, which struck me, when I heard it, as a fittingly honest use of a talent for telling people that something worn out was better than it was. I sold the bungalow in Sunny Slope in 2005, not out of any bad feeling for it, but because a friend from the choir was giving up her land, and I bought 11 acres back in Adams County, not 40 miles from the field where Oxel taught me to shake a jar of seed and read the sound of it. And I built a small house with a big south window, and I moved my mother's jade plant into it, and it has since grown taller than I am. And this is where I want to leave you, because the brief of my own life, if I were writing it, would not end at a country club or a courthouse. And this story of mine has never really been about Lyle Brenner, who was only ever the face bolted to the front of someone else's ambition. It was about the eye my father gave me, and the currency a man tried to counterfeit, and the long, slow discovery that I had never actually needed him to tell me I was good at my work. Last Tuesday morning, at 81 years old, I stood in the doorway of my seed shed with the low light coming in flat across the stubble, and I shook a mason jar of hard red winter wheat that my great-nephew Soren, who is 19 and studying agronomy at Pullman on his own scholarship, had brought me to look at. I held it up to my ear and shook it, the way I have shaken 10,000 jars, and I listened to the plump, particular rattle of good seed, and I told him it was a fine lot, better than fine, and that he had a good eye, and I watched him fold the compliment up small and put it in his pocket like a warm stone. Then I handed him the jar, and I put the kettle on, and I got down the tin box with the tulips on the lid to find my grandmother's Lefse card, because he was staying for lunch, and there was nothing in the whole clear morning that anyone had to prove.